here to talk about food and climate. I mean, most of you guys probably know this, but the food system is now about a third of global emissions. It's kind of the it doesn't get talked about as much as fossil fuels, but the challenge is really pretty clear. By 2050, we're going to have to make probably about 50% more food, and we're going to have to do it with about 75% fewer emissions and no more land. In fact, we're going to have to use less land and reforest some of the land that we've been using to grow all that food. So it's going to be a really hard challenge. Fossil fuels is also a hard challenge, but at least we kind of know what to do. Food, much less clear. And we've got three awesome panelists here who you've got their bios in front of you, so I'm not going to introduce them, but they're working on really interesting ways of attacking these problems. So I'm just going to turn it over to them first to let them tell a little bit about what they're doing. So starting with you, Ndidi.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. My name is Ndidi Nwuneli. I'm a social entrepreneur based in Lagos, Nigeria, and I wear a number of hats in the food ecosystem. I'm the co-founder of Sahel Consulting, Agriculture and Nutrition, which works across Africa, transforming the food ecosystems. We specifically work from farm to fork in seed systems, in dairy, in indigenous crops like yam and cassava, and we enable farmers to improve their productivity as well as access markets, but we also fix all the challenges across the ecosystem. I'm also the co-founder of Ace Foods, which is an agro-processing company, and we started it to address the high rates of post-harvest losses. 40 to 60% of our fruits and vegetables, spices, and herbs go to waste. So we source from 10,000 farmers and process for the local market. And my third heart is as the founder of Africa Food Change Makers, which is a one-stop shop for food and ag entrepreneurs in Africa. Our vision is 1 million entrepreneurs that are scaling, nourishing Africa, and changing global narratives. So in addition to providing training on climate, enabling them to pivot as agribusinesses, we also enable equity, diversity, and we use stories and positive examples to change the face of Africa from a hungry child to a successful female African farmer or entrepreneur. We tell positive stories using podcasts, but we want to get the best food from our continent onto global shelves. So those are the hats I wear, and I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. My name's Tannenbaum. I grew up in San Francisco. I'm a surfer. I'm a Gemini. In the beginning of the pandemic, it kind of hit me in the head pretty hard because I didn't have anything going on, so I was downloading PDFs on the EPA website that the single largest thing in the landfill in the United States is food. And it just seemed like a bonkers idea that we throw away 40% of the food that we grow. And then you dig a little deeper, and the single largest source of that food in landfills in the US is our households. I mean, we have to solve on-farm waste, think about productivity. But the company that I founded with my co-founder Matt, called Mill, we're working on keeping food out of the landfills, focused on changing behavior in the home. And it starts with a new kind of bin that effectively makes it easy to do the right thing. We grind up dry out food, which shrinks it down. And then we've partnered with the US Postal Service to get it back to farms as an ingredient in chicken feed. But it's just this really interesting, impactful problem that's sort of hiding in plain sight, which is waste. And I've just become obsessed with that and excited to talk about food system and where we go from here with these great folks.
So my name is Mirtha Kastrapeli. I am based in New York, and I work for a company called ISS. I'm the sector head for the corporate ratings research team for everything consumer related, including food and ag. And what does that mean? So what we do is we assess companies, corporations, around their environmental, social, and governance practices. And we share these, or we provide these insights and data to institutional investors or clients to help them make better, or more informed decisions. Part of my job is to make sure that the methodology that we're using is actually relevant, that we're asking the right questions when we're making these assessments, that we have the right metrics, that we're actually looking at the right indicators. So very excited to be developing research around sustainable agricultural practices to make sure that that's incorporated in our process. And just to give you an example how investors use our data, right? So they can use our information to build portfolios, so stock selection, to better manage risk, climate risk, and also look for opportunities, to build portfolios with specific ESG mandates or social and environmental mandates for those thematic investment strategies. So if they're interested in water or food or labor rights, they're able to use that information to develop these strategies. But more importantly, and one part that is very exciting about this research and what investors could do, is that you can engage with companies. You can go out, talk to companies, and say, what are you doing about this, with some of the research that we develop. So it is an important part of the ecosystem in finance, is to have the right information and making sure, like I said earlier, that we're asking the right questions for companies and hopefully make more conscious decisions about our investments.
So it's great. So we have working on the investment side. We have working on the consumer side. Ndidi working both on the with entrepreneurs, with farmers, with their own agro processing. Let's start talking a little bit about money, because that's probably what makes pretty much at every level of the chain is going to make it work. What's missing? Where does the money have to come from? And what are the obstacles to getting the kind of money that can make this scale? Maybe start with you, Ndidi.
So I wear a number of hats in addition to the ones where I work. I sit on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation and AGRA and a few other organizations around catalytic financing, and then our sister company, Sahel Capital. And what we see in the ecosystem is a gap for funding the missing middle. And what we call the missing middle in our ecosystem are the small and medium-sized enterprises that are so critical to the food ecosystem. In the US, you'd say the mom and pop shops, the retailers, the chefs. But every company has to start as a small and medium-sized enterprise in the food ecosystem, and the innovation, the job creation comes from this group. But they're often considered risky, right? And so in our work, what we're doing is de-risking investment in them by providing data about them, showcasing them, increasing their visibility, and highlighting their impact. Around innovation, around climate adaptability, those are the real game changers, the small and medium-sized enterprises. And it's exciting that AGRA, which is the Alliance for Green Revolution, and Rockefeller also recognize these intervention areas, and so does the MasterCard Foundation. So we've been very, very excited about what the philanthropic community is doing in that area. In terms of the formal financial services sector, they still see ag and climate and food as a risky intervention. They see farmers as risky investments. And we're trying to demystify them as well. So through Africa Food Changemakers and Sahel, what we're doing is not only providing the data, the hand-holding, the mentoring, but also increasing the visibility, because what you see in our ecosystem, I'm sure if I went around the room, you have a few darlings. Maybe Mill is one of the darlings right now that all the funders are excited about and they gravitate towards them, right? But we have thousands of mills waiting to happen, and our job is to uncover them. And I've gone on a big mandate now around local organizations, which is let's fund local organizations working in communities, because they can use the money most effectively and they can ensure change quicker. And so for those of you who have influence around financing in the room, please always think about funding. Measure how many local organizations you're funding, how many women-run organizations you're funding, and where that money is going, and who in the community sits on those boards, because money has the opportunity to change the way we work and the way we live.
Mirtha, here in Florida, we're hearing a lot lately about ESG. Not always in the, not always in the way that people doing it would hope. But I'm interested, as you're looking to, talk to investors and do and provide the research on this kind of thing. Where is where is the ESG space? There's a lot of skepticism, not only from, kind of right-wing politics saying like, oh, it's all just woke investing, but there are also real concerns about, is this actually, climate friendly? Is this actually eco-friendly? Talk about, how that space is developing and how it can be a sort of force in kind of fixing some of these problems.
Yes, so yeah, we've definitely been in the news a lot, especially as a rating agencies, because we also provide ratings. So I think there's a little misconception. So what we do is just information. I always clarify that ESG research is just insights to help, like I said earlier, our clients make better informed decisions. One area that ESG, particularly ESG integration, it's again the most popular type of investment strategy when you think about environmental and social issues. It's about risk management. It's purely a risk management tool. And when we look at even when we assess our companies, we are focusing about those negative impacts or negative externalities. I want to make sure that corporations are understanding those negative impacts and they're managing those negative impacts. In the EU taxonomy, they talk about the do not significant harm approach, and making sure that at least corporations are not, again, making things worse. And a lot of the solutions being really driven by startups, by venture capital, by private equity. But one of the, and maybe I'm touching here a little bit on some of the findings from the research that we've done so far, particularly around regenerative agriculture and sustainable food, it's that big corporations, rather than being just, make sure that you don't make things worse, but actually how can they be part of the solution? And this is actually one of the most exciting parts that I've noticed and that we're seeing from corporations. Over half of the food companies that we cover, we're talking about public equities, like the big names that you can imagine, that actually are already piloting regenerative agricultural practices, but more importantly, they're also signaling and they're working with their suppliers about what is expected from them regarding agricultural practices. So there is that side of the opportunity, not thinking about ESG as a risk management tool, but also looking at opportunities and thinking about these corporations as a key component for solutions. Because again, they have the power to really drive and really influence their suppliers to change some of these practices. So I guess I touched a little bit about not only ESG, but also some of the initial findings from our work.
Well, this is great, and I want to hope we'll have time to get back to some of the substance of some of what you're looking at with regenerative ag in particular, which has become very controversial. But let's Harry, food waste I think is not controversial, right? If we're wasting 40% of our food, we're wasting 40% of the land, 40% of the fertilizer, 40% of the water that we use to grow it. Just not good. But obviously it's not a problem where you can just say, oh, stop doing that not good thing. Harry, as I'm sure many of you know, has had a kind of successful company in the past that worked out pretty well, and so he's been able to raise a lot of investment from people who think that this will be a financially successful business. Also, if you could talk a little bit about your people who have these bins are going to be paying for it. There's going to be a subscription model. Talk a little bit about how, here's something that's just good for the world, reducing food waste. How can climate finance, government finance, and consumer finance, how can that be mobilized to make this happen?
It's a great question, or maybe it's like 3 questions in there. I'll try to untangle them. So first of all, zooming way out, if we're going to decarbonize the economy, we need systems change. And to change the systems that we have today on the planet, which have come into place over the last couple hundred years, there's a lot of infrastructure that's needed. There's a lot of capital that needs to move around. When we're talking about solving climate change, it's not just electrons. We need to move atoms. And when we talk about energy, we might be talking about a new grid. Or when we're talking about food, we're talking about new pathways. So capital markets and finance definitely are key to this. And the bank will go unnamed, but I will say there have been meetings where we go talk to a bank, and there's one side of the coin where we can be talking about bringing equity capital into a business, selling part of the business in exchange for equity ownership from an outside investor. But really, as we think about climate companies scaling, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built. And that infrastructure is often built with debt and credit. And I think this is a key gap that exists. This bank that won't be named, we sat down and they said, oh my goodness, this sounds amazing. We'd love to lend you money when you have $1 billion of revenue a year. And it's like, thanks, see you never. And so I think there's a gap there, and it really is important. The catalytic funds that are out there that are looking to help enable first of their kind instruments come into existence, and folks out there that are looking to take a risk on something that isn't totally proven out. Now, I think that sort of relates to your second question, which is a little bit, okay, this sounds like a cool thing that Mill is building, but it requires people to pay for it. And is that something everyone can have? And I think this is something we think about internally a lot. And we also think about parallels to technologies like solar or electric vehicles. With new technology, you have to start somewhere. The first solar panels were not nearly as affordable or efficient or environmentally friendly as the solar panels that we have today. Fast forward 10 years, I'm not sure what everybody will be driving. Maybe we'll just all be riding bikes or something like that. But rewind 15 years, and the people that had Teslas were a small number of them, and I think the brakes didn't even work on them. So there's a trajectory that occurs with technology adoption that starts small, and necessarily starts with early adopters. As we think about changing the food waste system, we think it can start small with individual action. What we're talking about is individual households taking action, signing up, diverting food from the landfill. But the way that we see this scaling is through partnerships with municipalities. But you can't go straight there. You need to prove out that, hey, this new technology actually works. It actually changes behavior. It actually keeps food out of the trash and armies of raccoons from attacking households and things like that. And from lily pad to lily pad, you can sort of move up the stack of capital markets and move up the stack of adoption.
So Ndidi, this leads perfectly into, because I want to hear what are we going to, because Africa, presumably you're not going to be able to have people paying $30 a month for a cool garbage can. What does Africa need, and how can, because you can't wait either, right? How can you start reducing emissions, reducing waste, and really, attacking these problems now?
Okay, thanks so much. I think first we don't want to talk about Africa. We have 54 countries in Africa. So we talk about country-specific interventions, and there are some countries that are already farther ahead than even many cities in America when it comes to climate. And what we actually can teach the world when we think about regenerative agriculture is that we have been doing regenerative agriculture, age-old practices on the continent. What we need to learn is how to do regenerative agriculture and still achieve productivity to ensure that we can feed people. And the big challenge is around measuring that impact. I think a lot of our farmers are not getting the climate financing, even though they are contributing to reduction in emissions, because they're not measuring, because they're not able to get that data into the hands of the Goldman Sachs trader, who can then pay them the carbon credits. And when people talks about carbon farming, so many of my farmers are excluded from carbon farming because they're not included in the global financial system. And so I think we have to build that bridge very deliberately. Otherwise, we continue to disadvantage the most innovative farmers at the front end. The second piece, and when you were talking, Harry, I thought about this. And we had a conversation earlier at breakfast. Only 2% of climate financing goes to women-run businesses. Women-owned businesses, only 2%. And that's even where the data is captured, right? And even when you break it down to, catalytic financing, funders, etc., on the continent, the Bridgeplan Group found out that only about 5.9% of funding allocated to Africa actually gets to African organizations. So the vast majority stays in the West. It stays in the US and Europe, supposedly earmarked for Africa, but ending up in Washington, D.C., in large consulting firms, etc. So what can we do to change that? We need to alter the financing flows and ensure that funding that is allocated to specific regions actually gets there. And because I also work a lot with African philanthropists, the data that Bridgeplan Group found out, only 14% of funding from African philanthropists goes to African organizations, because the same international organizations are competing for that funding from African philanthropists, even where it's patient grant financing. So I think those of you who are in the room who have the opportunity to ask these tough questions when funding flows are being allocated is to ensure that we rebalance this. We shift power around financing. Otherwise, the type of growth that we expect to see and the scaling that we expect to see will not happen. And it's urgent and it's now.
Maybe we should. So there's a lot of talk about these, about in climate finance, and particularly these carbon markets, which we're starting to see in the U.S. We're starting to see it around the world in drips and drabs, and in some sense, it feels a little bit like the worst solution except for all the others. But I'm wondering, how. Presumably that's going to have some of the same problems, right, in terms of the finance. How can you set up a carbon market that is going to reward the things we want and presumably in some sense discourage the stuff we don't want, and yet still have it get to people who aren't currently banked in the larger sense?
Yes, I mean, yeah, the carbon markets, it's complicated, it's growing, and I think there is a role to play. Because one thing and I'm going to go back to this in a second, but when we think about finance, and I've been in the finance industry and investment industry for, I'm going to say, almost 2 decades now, it's about incentives, right? It all goes down to incentives. So, that trader in Goldman Sachs, what is he incentivized to do? Right? So if it's profit maximization at all cost, that's his job. If you're an asset manager and your goal is to, again, fund risk-adjusted returns or maximize risk-adjusted returns, that's what you have to do. So this is where mandates, when I mentioned earlier about building portfolios that have a climate mandate, which is a lot of the asset owners, pension funds, they are saying we want our portfolios, private wealth, retail investors. So when an asset manager has a mandate where they said you need to consider climate, you need to consider all these other environmental issues, this is where the wheels start to turn. So we need to get those mandates and those, again, signals from the owners of capital for the industry to start, again, acting. So one thing that going back to agriculture, so there's a lot of interest right now on climate. So everybody's a climate investor these days, right? Everybody has a climate mandate, if you will. But I asked this question last year. I was at a conference, and I was talking to somebody, asking about food, and we're doing some research around the food industry. And he said, "Oh, I'm not interested in food. I'm just a climate. We just have a mandate on climate." And I said,
"Oh no!"
I'm like, well, if you're a climate investor, you need to be talking about food and ag. And he's like, "Oh, okay, interesting." But yes, I mean that is a true story from an investor in New York. So sophisticated investors, by the way. So this is where we are doing some awareness, some education. This is the work that we do. But going back to incentives. So if we have the right incentives for that asset manager, for that asset owner, we are providing that information. And we're also creating the signals for corporates. And this is what I think corporates is exciting. Public equities are exciting in this spot, in addition to not only the startup side, because these corporations are getting signals also from the market in one way that we care about these issues and they need to start addressing physical and transition risks from climate. And when they start realizing this, they are incorporating different practices that are going to be more climate smart, water smart, regenerative agriculture, and we can go back to that. And then work with their suppliers to really be those catalysts, working with small farmers, provide the training, provide the resources, provide those contracts where they said, we're actually just going to buy, raw material if you have these type of practices or sustainable practices. So again, if you think about the value chain, again, it is going from the owner of the capital to the manager to the corporate, and hopefully drives change and changes, the conditions for a lot of the farmers, which are obviously critical for the change. So, and just going back to your question about carbon markets, there is the possibility, obviously, to develop the nature equivalent of carbon markets. And that is also, I think, it has a place, particularly when we think about income and supplement income for a lot of these smaller farmers that need to, again, don't have, let's say, the return of investments to start incorporating some of these big changes, system level changes that are required. So yeah, I think those are my observations, I guess, on that space.
Something to add. I love what you do, which is data, but I think we need to hold these companies accountable for exactly what they're reporting. Because I was at WEF recently, and every single large corporate in food is talking about regen.
Yes.
And then you have fertilizer companies, crop protection companies, chemical companies talking about regen. And I bet you it's a small pilot in somewhere in the world where nobody will ever visit and nobody will ever measure. And unless we hold them accountable, they'll continue to get all the accolades for doing absolutely nothing to change behavior. And I think the civil society groups in the room also have to raise the ante on what is the barest minimum, what are the standards, and what is transformation, and what do we expect?
Yes, and I want to maybe respond to that because that's absolutely the case. So the threat of greenwashing, this is exactly what happening in climate, and it's happening in the food industry as well. That's our job. I always said, if there's an issue around greenwashing about data, that's on us. That's on me at the end of the day. And this is where we are making sure we're doing research and we're asking the questions to different stakeholders. So we're talking to experts, we're talking to academics, we want to talk to farmers. Are we asking the right questions? Because we know that the methodology that we develop for the food industry, and we develop these 40-page reports that we give to investors, are going to drive a lot of decisions. So I want to make sure that we're asking the right questions. And because, again, that's the signal. So this is part of the work that we do in the ESG space, even though, again, it's been vilified, where we are really trying to step on top of the issues, making sure that it's industry specific. It also depends on where you are in the value chain, depends on your business model, and making sure we basically have kind of our ears open to develop those kind of metrics that are really going to make a difference. But it is a challenge. Greenwashing in general in the ESG space is something that we take very seriously.
Maybe I should have mentioned when I started, but I didn't introduce myself. I'm working on a book about how to feed the world without frying the world, and sort of spoiler alert, it's kind of complicated. It's not like, again, fossil fuels also very complicated, but we kind of know what we're supposed to do, right? Not use so many, eventually use none. This stuff is really complicated, and it leads to this question of who's going to, if you have these markets, if you have this climate finance that's going to reward the good stuff, what's the good stuff, and who's going to decide? And I guess the question, maybe Harry can take the first shot at it, is are the markets going to be good at deciding this? And are international institutions, which again, they've made some mistakes on this stuff too. Are they going to be good? And then governments. What's the government's role? My mayor, not Miami Beach's mayor. Now that I'm in Miami, his big tagline is "How can we help?" But how can government help on this stuff?
Okay, so another three-parter. I think I love it. So I think at the top level, when we think about building businesses that are sustainable, we want to build businesses that are good for the planet, but businesses that also sustain themselves. And I think a really good outcome that we will see over time is that the companies that are doing the right thing for the planet are also performing better on their bottom line. And in that way, these things are related. And that can be a good signal to markets. I think to attract capital, to scale, to grow, things need to make sense economically. And the way we think about it at Mill is if we're going to encourage the creation of a new system, it has to be better. It has to be rationalizable. It has to be awesome. So where we start is we start inside the home, thinking about how can we build just a kick-ass experience. We don't want people to sign up for our service necessarily first and foremost because it is good for the planet. we can appeal to their self-interest. No more stinky trash, no fruit flies, a bin that is just a bottomless pit. No joke, for my fiance and I, Rachel, the thing takes a month to fill up. So that's the conversation we're having with the consumer. Can we de-chorify your whole waste experience? Can we make this better? And can we do something good for the planet? And yes, my prior experience was at Nest, where we made a thermostat that was a connected thermostat that programmed itself, that saved energy. A lot of people purchased it initially because it was cool. You know, they saw it and they said, I wanted that. And, you know, fast forward a decade and we've saved 120 billion kilowatt hours of electricity with those things on walls. So there's a way, I think, from an entrepreneur standpoint, where our theory of change is we're focused on making it really easy to do the right thing and building good businesses. What capital markets are doing, where innovation can occur more locally, these are all tailwinds for us as the ecosystem comes together. But I think it has to be grounded in building a business that makes sense. Because I think if we need the world to change, we have to make systems that are better, not wag our finger at individuals to change behavior. And then to 3C, what's the role of government? I went to school for economics, so maybe this is the wrong answer, but my understanding is sort of role of government here is to create a society that is fair, that has rules that sort of don't drive us off cliffs, you know, and allow for evolution and innovation in the right way. But I don't think we can necessarily rely on government alone to fix this problem. You know, each of us as individuals can take action at home. Each of us can take individual action through voting. And then I think businesses as well need to come together to figure out pathways forward.
Thank you. I love what you're doing, and I agree with you to a large extent, but I think the government has an important role to play in ensuring that no one is left behind.
Absolutely.
The issue around equity and vulnerability means that many people might not be able to afford your waste bin in the short term. Can they be subsidized? Because they do also want the same benefits. And we see that across the board when it comes to nutritious food for the lowest income populations, for the most vulnerable. And that's why there's school feeding, right? Of healthy food in schools. Because guess what? Even in the United States, most public schools have the worst food. And our children are suffering for it. So who holds the government accountable to make sure that even in the lowest income schools, there's healthy food, there are vegetables, there are fruits, etc. So I think there's a place for governments in that, and then also a place for government in actually setting quotas around gender. And I keep on bringing gender. Tomorrow is International Women's Day. We have a long way to go when it comes to gender and climate. Women are the most affected by climate disasters all over the world. But they're also the decision makers in homes. And even in most vulnerable homes, they're also very pivotal. So we need them as climate champions. And unless we have quotas around financing for women, unless we enforce those quotas, we're not going to see change happen. So I think I just wanted to push that in because I think government has an important role at the federal, state, and local levels.
And totally agree with that as well. One last thing I'll say is I think public-private partnership ends up being the key to a lot of this, and finding that right intersection. I think we're all really excited about what's happened over the last year or so with this current administration and the focus on climate in this country, and I think there's action happening globally there. And for us, thinking about access and equity is something that we think about a lot as well. You know, if we're going to change systems at scale, it can't just be 1 out of 100 people that are taking advantage of something. It needs to be able to be in every home. And something that's neat is there are cities that are coming to us saying, hey, can we partner together to offer this at no cost to our residents? You know, because it changes the system in the right way, diverts material, reduces trucking, reduces landfilling, et cetera. But I think we have a ways to go across a litany of climate issues in terms of making sure that access and equity is present in how we think about each step of innovation.
That's great. I mean, obviously food waste is something that the economic incentives are automatically aligned, right? Because you don't want to waste. It's kind of, you're throwing your money out. For ag, it's not as obvious. And I think it's globally, there's something like $500 billion a year in subsidies for agriculture. And so much of it is perverse. I'm wondering, Ndidi, maybe you could take the first shot on, what would you, if you think of that $500 billion as a big pot of climate finance, as well as equity finance, what would you like to see happen?
So the subsidies are not evenly distributed, obviously, and in many parts of the world, and I'll use dairy as an example. Dairy is vilified in many parts of the world around climate. So Nigeria has the fourth largest cattle herd in Africa, but we're one of the largest importers of dried powdered milk from the Netherlands and many other parts of Europe. Now, these companies in the Netherlands are owned by farmers who are highly subsidized, and some of them are large multinationals. And so my work in the dairy sector, I'm fighting against a global trend where, okay, we're going to fix things in the Netherlands, but we want to export our milk to you, and we don't want you guys to fix your milk ecosystem. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. This is real. And Harvard Business School wrote a case study about the project we work on called Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria. And so you see subsidies at work and how they actually foster inequity and how they destabilize economies. And it's not just subsidies, it's food aid. And I have a big problem with food aid. And right now, as you know, there's a global food crisis. And what you hear the WFP and other organizations talking about is, oh, let's get food into countries where they're needed. Give us billions of dollars to get food in. Let's get seeds, let's get fertilizer, the Ukraine war. And I'm like, please don't bring your fertilizer or seeds into our ecosystem because we have a local seed industry. And if you dump seeds in our country, 80 companies are going to go out of business. But that's not the rhetoric that's shared. And that's why you need data. That's why you need efficient value chains. And that's why we need entrepreneurs who are from these countries speaking at these platforms. So subsidies in all forms need to be reallocated to creating wealth and not reducing poverty, to ensuring equity and not destabilizing ecosystems for the benefits of those who are in power. So I've become, even though I have a private sector background, I've become a socialist in my old age because I think it's really time that we ask the tough questions, but we also challenge whoever is making the decisions on behalf of people.
And I want to jump in, and this is, I'm going to put my another hat, not the ISS hat. In my previous life, I worked at the Ministry of Economics in Nicaragua back in the early 2000s. And it's not a conspiracy theory, it's right. That's exactly what happened to us in Central America. Particularly was around peanuts. We had a peanut industry that we wanted to develop. And again, that was, as a government. And then we went dumping. And then corn, same thing. We got dumped all the produce of subsidies from the US and was destabilizing the market. And it was very, very problematic for us that we wanted to develop the local market. So during that time, a tag became a little popular. I don't know if you may have come across this, but it was trade, not aid. Let us do the trade. Let us develop our own markets. Stop dumping your subsidized, commodities. That, again, it's really affecting our ability to really develop. So, again, this is my Nicaragua Ministry of Economics hat from 20 years ago. But I completely relate. So I just wanted to say that it's not conspiracy and it happens around the world.
Harry, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I think I can jump in if encouraged. I mean, something that comes to mind for me is what we're talking about is how can we have more efficient systems with less waste? And there are exogenous forces on local markets that can create gaps for opportunity or efficiency there. And we don't sort of want artificial bloat in the way that businesses can grow or operate. I think zooming out to our food system, the food system in general is super inefficient today, and something that, is staring us right in the face in this country is the fact that we trash 40% of the food we grow, which is just wildly inefficient. You think about the agricultural system being 25% of emissions, 8 to 10% of emissions, food waste and loss, 3x the airline industry. It is just bonkers. And that is just an ingrained ritualistic behavior in how we operate. Not that much of the US has any pathway for uneaten food other than the landfill or an incinerator. And that's just an incredibly inefficient way to use this amazing resource, which is delicious. You're effectively trucking around water on a weekly basis in a big diesel truck, dumping it in a landfill where it turns into methane. It's atrocious from a climate perspective, but it's also just atrocious from is this a good use of resources? Is this the right way to allocate this thing that took water and land and time and energy to grow? I think a thread between all of this is building an economy, building a food system that is going to be more just and have more access and be better to the planet is one that is going to have less waste in it and be more efficient.
Now, and this maybe back to you, Harry, because I think we know from a climate perspective, first two things that if everyone in this room wants to help the climate with your diet, you want to eat less beef and waste less food. Those are pretty much the two things. But great, except beef is delicious and food waste is really easy to do. Harry, you're obviously, your company is pioneering one way of trying to attack this problem, but I'd be interested in the others as well. How do we get consumers to change behaviors? Is presumably just wagging your fingers at them and saying meat is murder, that doesn't seem to work so well. But what are around the world, what do you see as the kind of ways to change behavior in a big way?
I think the first step in thinking about behavior change is that it has to be as frictionless as possible. As an entrepreneur, we just have to accept that unfortunately people are pretty lazy and set in their ways. So when we think about a behavior change problem, it's about how can we mimic the existing behavior as much as possible? How can we make this as easy as possible of a switch? And how can we create an experience that's better than the one that someone has today? Because you really can't trust that people will sustain or adopt a new ritual if it's work. So that's sort of the first piece of thinking about how we change behavior. And how can you make it fun? How can you make it cool? How can you make it easy? These are the things that I think when we think about designing a new system or designing an experience, when we built the Nest thermostat, people were used to a round thermostat on a wall that you turned. So we didn't, pun intended, reinvent the wheel there. When we thought about the bin that we're putting into people's homes, we mimic the experience of scraping a plate into a normal trash bin. How can we focus on fewer changes, teaching people to do less thinking to adopt a new ritual?
For me, I have come to this from a lens where I'm really focused on changing the way people view food and Africa. So I mentioned the face of Africa being a hungry child and the face of poverty being a female farmer from Africa. How are we changing that? By helping the average person realize that they come in contact with food from Africa every day. If you had a coffee today, most likely it was from an African country. You might not realize that coffee was born in Ethiopia. 18 countries in Africa produce coffee. If you had hot chocolate, 70% of cocoa comes from two countries, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, right? Rooibos, grown in the hills of South Africa. Teff is a great alternative to white flour. It's gluten-free, it's nutritious. And so if we start thinking about how African food has shaped global food systems, how if you've had a sesame bagel today,
Guilty.
60% of the sesame comes from Sudan. But when you think about Sudan, you think of poverty and starvation and war, right? So if we start realizing that, we actually interact with this continent, that the people, they have agency and they can change their own food systems. They already eat most of the food that they grow in the continent. Do you understand? That changes your mindset about the continent. We're trying to ensure that jollof rice becomes as popular as sushi, right? Most of us have never been to Japan, but we love sushi. Jollof rice is even better. So the point is, for me, narrative changing is so important when it comes to food systems. because you start realizing how dependent you are on that farmer or that food processor. Or when you get to your local grocery store, you see a really nice packaged food that's actually processed in Nigeria. And one of our entrepreneurs makes amazing snacks from food waste. And it's nutritious, it's healthy, it's world class. Then you open it and you say Nigeria, and you're like, oh, they don't send 419 emails. Oh, they actually make really good snacks. It's no longer the email association or corruption. You know, that shift happens. And then you realize the power of food because you're ingesting it and you're having a relationship with it and it connects you. So for me, changing narratives, changing the food ecosystem is about respect through the value chain. Because if we respect the farmer and how much effort went in, we don't waste the food. We treasure it. And then we treasure the people who made the food. And we realize how united we are as a world. So I come to this now from a very different lens because I think it's important that we take ownership for the food ecosystem. We realize how powerful it is and how dependent we are on it. And we work collaboratively to shape it and to change the future.
That's great. I mean, I put solar panels on my house and I then never think about it again, right? You turn on the light, it's no different. But we vote on our food 3 times a day, hopefully, or more. So it's definitely it's more cultural, it's more behavioral, it's more part of our lives. And so to all of you. So we'd love to take some questions. If I think is somebody gonna in front here?
Hi. I realize you go into the supermarket, they have the bread, the whole bakery department is filled. They want you to see all this abundance, and they, get rid of a lot of it. My son was a friggin' and was dumpster diving for years for this reason, and I established a food bank in my community. So my question is, you're talking about 40% is being thrown out. That's just household, or we're talking about all the markets? I mean, where we are, we have trucks that go around and collect food from Publix and other places, and they go through the food bank, and we have 60 partner organizations, and we donated 20 million pounds of food in my community last year. So what are we talking about numbers wise? You only talking about in the home, or you're talking about the markets and all that food that a lot of them throw it away?
Great question. So the 40% is across the entire value chain: farms, grocery stores, restaurants, homes. Now, each of those steps has food loss and waste. When we talk about how much of that gets reintroduced into the food system, and just to take a step back, the EPA has a wonderful hierarchy of the highest and best uses of food, effectively. And the best thing to do with food is eat it. Not waste it in the first place. And when we talk about food donation and food rescue, that's the next step. The next best thing after that would be feeding that material to an animal, effectively keeping food as food. We use 1/3 of the Earth's arable land to grow food for animals. 1/3 of the grain we grow on the planet is for livestock. After that, there are ways to get energy out of the food or nutrients out of the food. We might be talking about conversion into a fuel or composting, and then the worst thing you could do with that food is throw it in a landfill. When we look at what percentage of food from each step of the value chain ends up in the landfill, our homes are the biggest offender. Grocery stores, restaurants, farms tend to do a better job of finding a circular pathway for those nutrients because they are profit motivated to do so. And grocery stores have food in bulk that often they can't sell, or for whatever reason is not perfect enough for their shelves, which is a whole nother panel. Like, I don't know what it'd be called, but we could spend an hour talking about that. And I think that's very important.
They throw away things that still have a shelf life several months long. My son would get stuff like that.
I mean, don't get me started on Best By dates. I saw this story of this pink Himalayan sea salt that was 20 million years old, and then on the box it said Best By 2024. It's doesn't really box. So I think at each step of the chain we need to focus on circular solutions. and ideally solutions that are local and regenerative. The biggest culprit of food in the landfill in the United States is us in our homes today.
And just to, right, I was just going to say that that's in the sort of the developed world. In the developing world, it's a very different situation where there's much more on-farm loss, spoilage, lacking infrastructure to get food to market, lacking markets in the first place.
We get a lot of vegetables and fruits that they would be thrown away, and 70% of the food that we give out is fresh food.
And I would just say on the corporate side, this is something that we're currently assessing. Practices of corporates in other parts of the value chain, as Harry was saying, what are corporates doing in regards with their processes with their suppliers? So we are already measuring kind of circular economy or circular food principles to reduce food waste as well. So it is something that some corporations are paying attention to it, but there is clearly a lot of improvement there.
Next question in the back there.
One topic we didn't get a chance to talk about today is the risk that occurs because of labor loss from climate change, particularly in agriculture. We know that billions and billions of dollars are lost every year from heat exposure to the workforce that produces the food for us, and just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about if any of your work crosses that topic and how that's incorporated into risk.
So absolutely. I mean, labor rights in general, that's something that we look very closely when we do our assessments. We didn't talk a little bit about regenerative ag, but a lot of the regenerative ag practices that corporations are currently having in place, they're focused on soil health. And we could argue what's the definition of regenerative ag, and some may argue that it's all about soil health. But if you look at a broader definition, you would definitely look at farmers and again, and labor rights, including, but indigenous populations as well. So there is a broader definition that we try to assess, but it's really hard the more disconnected it is. If there's so many steps from your, like I said, if you're a corporate, if there's so many steps away from your operation, I think it's a little harder to manage. But it is part of the due diligence process that is required for a lot of these companies in regards to their suppliers. And just to mention on regulation, I didn't mention earlier, there are more stringent regulations around due diligence process and about supply chains and even about circular economy principles in Europe. So Europe is way ahead of us in regards to what is expected from companies, for food and ag companies, around a lot of these issues. We're still waiting for a technical document that is expected to be released hopefully this year, what is going to have very, very detailed guidelines around a variety of issues and environmental and social issues for food and ag companies. If coming from the European Union, hopefully in the US will follow at some point, but we'll have to wait and see.
Next question. There in the back.
Thank you. I was curious to learn more about so we've talked a lot about food waste solutions, and that seems to be very important in the global north, but in the global south, a lot more interested in the food loss, so post-harvest losses and how we're dealing with that. I think we've seen in very recent years that a big part of that is that system level stuff, right? So you have a lot of export-oriented value chains or really, really messy local ones that prevents food getting to local communities. So I'm curious about how that's being addressed.
So yeah, there's definitely a lot of innovation coming up in this area. Historically, our value chains have been focused on export. So from farm to the port, as opposed to from farm to market. So we're totally having to alter those, ensuring we have pack houses, refrigerated trucks, on-farm processing, equipment and solar-powered equipment at the farm so that there can be some pre-processing before it comes to the SMEs. And that's why through Africa Food Change Makers, we're doing a lot of education around what is available, what innovation, and how to partner. to reduce the cost and accessibility to those who need it the most. But I still believe we need to invest more in local processing. And that's why we started Ace Foods. So we started this company 12 years ago to process food for the local market. And it started with basic spices, right? And then complementary foods and snacks. And we've realized farmer behavior will change when they know they have an off-taker that's consistent, that's willing to pay them to change behavior and partner with them to advance. And then consumers are excited when they have a proudly Nigerian product on the shelf and when you can educate them about the benefits of sourcing locally. But the impact across the ecosystem with catalytic food processing companies that are using climate smart approaches is phenomenal. And we need to have more of those, and they need to be working at scale.
Hi, thanks for holding this panel. I actually have a question about another player here who, that I haven't heard mentioned very much, and that's the role of major ag corporations in blocking some of the progress that you're talking about. Especially, I think this is for Ndidi and Michael, but if the other panelists want to weigh in, a lot of those big ag companies are in the United States, and so could you talk a little bit about the role that they play, and both in whatever way you want to discuss it. Thanks.
Well, I definitely we assess obviously those big players. They have a critical role to play because they are working with their suppliers, right? So we are not everybody, about 50% of the largest food and ag companies that we cover have already in place some sort of pilot on regenerative agriculture, so they're talking about it. The other ones are not even mentioning some of these practices. We are very critical, obviously. They can get the lowest grade that we can give, which is a D-. But this is a signal from the market. If you're an investor that is looking at these issues, our information says that they're not doing anything about it, and that's a flag. But talking about the role they play is absolutely critical because of the influence they have with their suppliers and their value chain.
I mean, I just wanted to clarify that I mean not just what they're doing as far as regenerative agriculture, but also policies that they're pushing.
Yes, so lobbying activities.
With our country, with our government, and with other countries.
And why I think your question is so important is because of how concentrated the ecosystem is. I mean, there are 4 major ag companies now in the world, really 4. And then when we talk about retail, in a country like Canada, there are 3 major retailers for food in the whole country, 3 major ones. So they can dictate what happens in the value chain, and we have to hold them accountable. Now, I think this is where data comes in, but also where shareholder influence and activism comes in, because that is where you can change behavior. And then consumers. And I think the importance of consumers, I wrote an article once about monopolies in the ag sector, because unless we start challenging, we've done very well with challenging the monopolies in the tech sector, at least raising issues around that. We need to do, and in oil and gas, we need to do the same in ag, because they're growing monopolies and they can influence what happens in Congress, but they can also influence what happens ultimately with consumers.
Yeah, and I want to add just very quickly on shareholder engagement. That's such an excellent point, and I mentioned it at the beginning of my introduction. The most powerful tool investors have today to influence companies around environmental and social practices is through shareholder engagement. It's not buying and selling stocks. Stock selection, ESG integration is not going to create the impact. The data that we develop, if it can be used to facilitate those conversations, that's the best use. The best way to create impact and to change company behavior is through engagement. So that is documented, well documented. So I just wanted to highlight that, but we are definitely very aware of lobbying activities against practices that are going to be more beneficial for the system as a whole, and it's obviously very problematic.
And I wanted to take one more, but first I'm going to have to be a little bit of the skunk at the garden party and just remind everyone that this stuff is complicated, and we can talk all day about a million evil things that big ag does, but just as a reminder that to frame the problem, we are going to need a shit ton of food over the next 30 years. And it turns out that some of these, the ABCD guys who we all love to hate, they're really good at making lots of food. So part of the challenge, I think, going forward is going to be how can we get into that Venn diagram of making lots of food and being a little less evil? That's going to be really important, and it's not just going to be like, well, it's an exaggerated example, but you saw what happened in Sri Lanka, where it was just, oh, we're just gonna, everybody's gonna go organic, and that didn't go so well, and it didn't make so much food, and I know there were a lot of idiosyncratic issues there, but I just think it is something to keep in mind. See if we could take one more. I think there in the middle.
Hey, I had a question for Harry. Is there a reason the compost goes towards chicken feed rather than soil? Because as we know, soil is eroding and it takes about 100 years to make 1 inch of healthy soil, so I feel like it's a really critical issue.
Soil health is completely important. What we are thinking about is the highest and best use of this material. And effectively, the stuff that comes out of our bin is still food. And if we think about the loop that erodes soil, the thing that's pulling nutrients out of soil is growing food. And if we have food and we can keep it as food and feed that to something, that is a more efficient loop than taking that food, feeding it to a microbe, creating a soil amendment to replenish the soil, to then grow something, to then potentially feed that to that same chicken. So we think about it as a tighter loop that has less leaks in it. That said, soil erosion and soil health is a critical problem we need to solve if we're going to keep the planet fed over time. And the thinking here is, okay, let's take the 40% of the food that we're throwing away and use as much of that as food so we don't have to grow as much to replenish that waste.
The chickens can help with the soil then too, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up, guys. But thank you so much, and thanks so much to these awesome panelists.